Hello everyone, welcome back. So today we will discuss services and its type, like what kind of services available in Kubernetes, right? So in last video, what we have discussed the deployment, right, which is the topmost layer in the hierarchy, where we can manage our pods, we can manage our application, we can manage our replica set, right? We can manage our rolling update strategies. All this stuff we can do with the deployment, right? Now you have deployed your application, right? And you want to uh, access this application from the outside world, right? Although we have already seen in this, right, as a kind of node port, we have exposed our deployment on as a node port service type, and we have tried to access our machines, right? Similarly, we have done for the replica set and the pod as well, right? But we need to understand, right, what is this service and how it can help to do this, right? So let me go back to the notepad, right? So service is nothing, right? Service is something which enables, right? Here you can see that, which enables the communication outside of cluster for the application running inside the pod or inside as well, right? With the other pod inside the cluster. What that statement telling is, let's say you have pods are running, right, and you want to you don't have that requirement to access these pods outside of your cluster, right? So due to the security reason, right, by default cluster IP is the service type if you haven't defined anywhere, right? So automatically the service type will get assigned to a cluster IP. One thing. Second thing is, due to the security in nature, right? Whenever you are creating a deployment, right, you will get a deployment, you will get a replica set, you will get a pod, obviously, right? But you never get a service automatically yet. Always you need to expose the service, right? Why? Because Kubernetes doesn't know whether you are creating that deployment is for your outside of the world or it's just an internal, right? Why? Because let's say you have a three-tier infra is running, right? One is the front end, obviously. Here you have, let's say, port 1, you have port 2, you have port 3. Fine. Then you have, let's say, app or maybe web server or the front end, and then the app tier, right? App server you have, and here also you have something called port 1, port 2, port 3, right? And at the layer, and let's say you have that something called DB servers is running, right? Here also you have port 1, port 2, port 3. Now if we discuss this, or if we see this, right, we don't need to expose these app server and DB server outside of the world. Why we should, right? Because we don't have our end user need to connect to this, right? And that will be the internal linking, right? Internal mechanism of our application, which will directly connect to the app servers, and then it will connect to the DB servers, right? So that is the reason that deployment will never give you a by default service exposed, right? That is something that you need to do it yourself, right? So this is the front end, right? So what will happen is we will gonna create a something called service here, right? This is the service for front end. Let's say this is the front end service. Fine. This is a front end service we have. Similarly, we have something called app service here, right? Similarly, we have something called this will come here, sorry, and this will come here. This is something called DB service. Now, if I go back to my node, if I run that get SVC, right? So here you can see we have type coming as a cluster IP, right? So this is the IP which you can access only inside the cluster, right? Not from the outside, right? In the previous video, whenever we discussed our deployment, right, we were exposed that deployment as a node port, right? And it was assigned some IP and that particular node port IP, right? We will see that in discuss detail now, but just try to understand this diagram, right? This is the front end, right? Only the front end will be, you can expose to this as a node port, right? Node port, or maybe as a load balancer, right? This is never required to be exposed as a node port or cluster IP. Why? Because here it is a internal, right? These doesn't need to be exposed outside. Only these ports needs to be communicate with this, right? And within the same network, right? We have already seen due to the COP proxy, all pods in the same network will be able to connect to the different ports, right? So here the same thing. What we can do is we can configure this traffic to be forwarded to this cluster IP service, right? And by default, it will behave as a kind of a load balancer, right? Which will follow a kind of random migration or maybe random redirection approach, right? Whenever traffic will come from these front end ports to this app service, which is a cluster IP, it will automatically forward your traffic to this. And if that is required to be connected to the DB service, the same approach will be followed here, right? This is again will be traffic forwarded to the cluster IP, which is a DB service, right? And again, it will be kind of load balancer, which will distribute your traffic towards your DB ports. That's how this work, right? So node port is nothing. Node port is something that your service will be exposed outside of the world using the node IPs, right? Wherever you have whatever the worker node, right? You can do that. Let's say it is mentioned also here. It listen to a port on the node, right? And forward request to the port using the service port. That's what if we see here, right? What we are doing is, let me do one thing. This is your worker node, let's say, okay? And you have IP something called 192.168.24.226. Let's say this is the IP you have, right? Under this worker node, you have something called service is running, right? And this service is, let's say, is only on 8080 according to this service file, right? And then you have the ports where you have the target port. Target port is nothing where your actual application is running, right? So what is happening with the node port, right? A random port will be assigned. Random port from which range? And random port will be assigned from this range, right? So let me put it here, this range, and that port will be getting listened on this. That's what it is mentioned, right? It is listen on to a port on the node, right? Because it will start listening on this IP, right? And any random port it will pick, which is free. Else there is a possibility you can define your own port as well from this range as a node port, right? And then what will happen is it will gonna forward that request to the internal service IP, right? Internal service which is listening on 8080, and from here the service knows what is my endpoint and what is the target port, and then that it will establish your communication. That's what we were doing so far, right? So this is how it is happening, right? Any port assigned to the node IP from this range, and then request will be forwarded to the service port, which referred as a port, because this is the service port, right? You can mention it is mentioned also already there, right? Service external port, and this is the only mandatory option in this definition file of service. If you don't put the target port, right? So what service will assume? Service will gonna assume that okay, it will be the same port for as we have defined for the service, right? And if you have a different port, then you need to define here, right? That's how it will work. And the protocol, obviously, that is also optional. And the node port, that's what I mentioned. If you want, you can give, otherwise it will give you a free random port. And the type, obviously, node port we are doing. If you don't define the type, the service will assume it as a cluster IP, right? That's what that the node port is. Clear? So node port is something that where we will do this, right? So cluster IP, that is also we understood, right? Cluster IP is something where we have a requirement to communicate only inside the cluster. Then you can expose your service as a cluster IP. There it will don't have that kind of what you call uh, external communication, right? So this is the cluster IP. It creates a virtual IP inside the cluster to enable communication between different services, such as front end, back end, and it is a default type of service as well. So that is the second type of the service we have. The third one is the load balancer, right? So load balancer is something that it's a kind of physical device which is sitting in front of your worker nodes, right? Which will actually redirects your traffic, right? Which manage the load, right? And it is supported in the cloud provider. Like we have the GCP, we have the Azure, and we have the AWS as well. So there it is definitely supported, and you can go and deploy your cluster, and you can put it behind the load balancer, and then you can do right. Why? Let's say if you because in this case what is happening is we have only one worker node. Let's say if you have multiple worker node, right? Worker 2, worker 3, right? And let's say you have worker 10, right? Now if you are running your pod which will have, let's say, 3 replica only, and you have created as a node port service type, like you have exposed it to some port on random, let's say 30098, whatever, right? Now you have done, right? So due to like any, don't, we are not using any kind of affinity rule or something, right? So what will happen is it will automatically deploy your 3 replica on any of the 3 node. Or maybe your all replica will be running on one node, right? Or maybe you have two on one and one is on one, or maybe it is having a different replica on different node. And any of could be the scenario, right? Now what will happen is you have the 10 IPs of your worker node, right? You have the 10 IPs worker node, and any IP you can go and you can access on this port, right? Your application will be reachable. That is fine, right? Because that's what that service will automatically get extended to cross all worker node. That's what the service nature is, right? That's the beauty of the service, right? Now if I need to share this application IP address or maybe the URL with my user, right? This is not something that I can share all the 10 IP, but that doesn't something seems good, right? I need to share only one particular kind of URL or maybe one IP, right? Which will act as a single IP where I don't need to define any of the port, right? I just want to go, let's say HTTPS path for cloud .com. Let's say this is my application, it is running, right? I want to access, being an end user, I just want to access this URL, right? I don't care what is happening behind the scene, right? So that way what you can do is you can define a load balancer, and as a backend pool you can define the all 10 worker node, and you can define that particular traffic forwarding to a particular IP, right? Listener rule you can define on the load balancer side, and that the load balancer responsibility to redirect your traffic to this, right? And if any of the replica goes, obviously we have that replica set, or maybe the deployment is running, which will take care if any of the pod is crashed, it will automatically assign that, and it will be automatically added to that particular service endpoint, because that service we have already exposed as a node port, right? We don't need to do anything extra, right? That's the configuration only we need to do, right? Or what you can do is, if you are running a virtual environment, which we will see in the going forward, right? What I will do is I will create a dedicated VM, and we will do a kind of configuration on that using the Nginx or maybe the HA proxy, and we will be pretend that VM as a load balancer, right? And we will access the IP of that particular VM, right? And we will see that whether it is forwarding our traffic to this node port service for our application or not, right? That we will see. But as of now, if you just need to understand what are the services is nothing which just enables your communication outside of your cluster. It is a three type: node port, cluster IP, load balancer. Node port is nothing where you will need to access your application using the node IPs on some random port from this range. Cluster IP is something that it will be assigning a virtual IP inside the cluster communication. And the load balancer is something where if you want to manage your load across all nodes, right? This is the mostly used scenario, right? Let's come to this. So here, if I show you, we have something called this web service, right? So here you can see it is doing it is a node port, right? So let's do one thing. Kubectl create hyphen f 02 hyphen. I'm gonna create one pod here. It is still creating. We need to wait. Now it's running, right? Now I'm gonna expose it as a cluster IP. So I have already a definition file defined, right? And it's done. If you see, we have this node board, right? So now you can see that this is the IP, right? Although you can go and access this IP on port 8080 and you will be redirected to our application, right? But this IP will not be gonna access from outside of the world. But if we need to access this, that's we have already seen what we can do. We can take this IP of our node and we can access on this port. We will reach to the same application, right? But here you can see the type is node port, right? Let's say, let me delete this kubectl get svc kubectl delete svc. Svc is by the way the short form of the service, right? I'm gonna delete this. It's deleted now, right? No more. Now I will access to this file and I will do this, right? I'm not defining any of the type of my service, right? Now let's create it again. It's created. And now if we see, so here you can see that by default it has created a cluster IP, right? Now there is no random port assigned. So there is no way that we can access our application from the outside of the world, right? Because this is the internal IP only assigned on this port. You can see. But if I'll do the same thing from outside, it will not go this. You can see because there is no communication. It's an internal IP, right? That's the purpose of this cluster IP, right? And the load balancer again, you need to define. For that, you have to configure a node load balancer only, right? For that, there is a different way to define. So that part we will see in the next video where we'll see, discuss the load balancer, right? In the cube cloud, or maybe we'll have that. You can see that it is never connected, right? Where we'll see that at dedicated VM we will consider it as a load balancer, right? So that was the service in the Kubernetes. I hope you like this content, right? And if yes, then please do share with this with other colleagues so that everybody will get to know what all services we have in the Kubernetes and how we can use and what are the use cases of those. All right. So that's it from this video. I will meet you in the next video. Till then, bye bye. Thank you.